Meteorologist Brandon Orr.
Is look at the conditions, the area, the brush fire today, and of course how the wind is carrying all that smoke.
Yeah, because so far this rainy season, the wind has been off the water.
Yeah.
So any of these fires that we've had in the Everglades, and we've had a few, take the smoke over to Naples. It spreads so much that sawgrass burns so fast that it just rapidly expands, produces a lot of smoke too. This is the burn area still.
What if I told you that the camera footage we're about to show you reveals something scientists didn't expect to find? Deep within Florida's vast swamplands, hidden from the public eye, new aerial drone footage has uncovered an environmental situation that's shocking researchers and conservationists alike. For decades, Florida's swamps have been portrayed as mysterious, dangerous places filled with alligators and murky water. But what happens when nature itself becomes the victim? When ecosystems that have thrived for thousands of years start showing signs of devastating change? That's exactly what this footage reveals, and the implications are far more serious than anyone anticipated. Let's start with the basics. Florida's swamps, particularly the Everglades and the surrounding wetland systems, cover millions of acres and represent one of the most biodiverse ecosystems on the planet. These aren't just watery wastelands. They're incredibly complex networks of interconnected waterways, hardwood hammocks, cypress forests, sawgrass marshes, and mangrove systems that have evolved over millennia. The Everglades alone is home to thousands of species. We're talking about alligators, crocodiles, manatees, panthers, countless bird species, fish populations, and invertebrates that most people have never even heard of. It's a system where every organism plays a crucial role. Remove one piece, and the entire puzzle starts to fall apart. But here's what's fascinating and alarming about this new footage. When researchers deployed high-resolution drone cameras across various sections of Florida's swamps over the past few months, they captured visual evidence of changes that didn't show up clearly on satellite imagery. The resolution was too high, the detail too specific, and what they found was genuinely surprising. The footage reveals massive sections of the swamp that appear to have undergone rapid transformation. We're talking about areas where the water chemistry looks visibly different. In some sections, the water that should be clear shows unusual discoloration. In other areas, vegetation that should be thriving appears to be struggling or completely gone. And then there are the patterns, strange, almost geometric patterns in how plant life is distributed. That suggests something systematic is happening, rather than random environmental degradation. Researchers working with the data were frankly baffled at first. They had to rule out equipment malfunction, atmospheric interference, and seasonal variations before they could accept what they were seeing was real. The water quality crisis. Let's talk about what might be the most disturbing discovery: water quality. The Everglades is, by definition, a river. It's a shallow, slow-moving system that moves water from Lake Okeechobee southward through Florida. The quality of this water determines everything about the ecosystem downstream. But the footage shows something alarming. In sections where the water should be relatively clear, or at least consistently colored, we see dramatic variations. Some areas show what appears to be excessive algae blooms. Now, algae in the Everglades isn't unusual, but the scale captured in this footage is absolutely massive. We're talking about blooms so extensive that they're visible from the air in stunning detail. Why does this matter? Because algae blooms indicate nutrient pollution. They suggest that nitrogen and phosphorus, the primary culprits behind water quality degradation, have reached levels that are triggering uncontrolled growth. These blooms consume oxygen as they decompose, creating dead zones where fish and other aquatic life simply cannot survive. The drone footage shows areas that look like they've been painted with a thick green layer. In some cases, the blooms are so dense that you can barely see the water underneath. This is a massive red flag because it indicates a fundamental change in the swamp's ability to filter and process nutrients naturally. But here's where it gets worse. The footage also reveals areas with discoloration that experts believe indicates extremely poor water quality. We're talking about brackish or contaminated water in areas where fresh water should be flowing. This could indicate saltwater intrusion, where ocean water is seeping into freshwater aquifers. Or it could indicate industrial or agricultural runoff finding its way into the swamp system. One researcher I spoke with described it this way: when you look at that footage and you see water that color in a location where we've never documented it before, Your first instinct is to think equipment failure. But when multiple drones capture the same phenomenon across different sections, and when it correlates with our ground measurements, you have to accept that something fundamental has changed. Vegetation, patterns, and ecosystem collapse. Beyond water quality, the footage reveals something equally disturbing about the vegetation. The Everglades is supposed to be dominated by sawgrass, a hardy marsh grass that can tolerate the wet, nutrient-poor conditions. But the drone footage shows massive sections where this sawgrass appears to be dying back or completely absent. In their place, we're seeing other vegetation patterns that suggest an ecosystem in transition. Some areas show encroachment of woody plants and trees, where you'd normally only see grasses and low vegetation. Other areas show what appears to be bare soil or water with almost no vegetation at all, which is extremely unusual. What's particularly striking is how the drone footage can capture these changes in their spatial distribution. You can see clear lines where vegetation shifts from one type to another. You can see patterns that suggest the ecosystem is literally reorganizing itself in real time. And that's exactly what concerns scientists most. Not just that change is happening, but that it's happening so quickly and so dramatically. One explanation for this could be related to salinity changes. If freshwater flow patterns have been disrupted, if saltwater intrusion is more severe than previously measured, then salt-tolerant species would naturally displace freshwater species. The footage seems to support this hypothesis. In some areas, you can see what appears to be mangrove vegetation, which tolerates salt, expanding into areas where it shouldn't be present. But here's the critical point. This would represent a fundamental shift in the Everglades' identity. The Everglades has always been defined as a freshwater system. If it's becoming brackish or saline, that's not just environmental change, that's ecosystem collapse. The wildlife that depends on freshwater conditions, from certain fish species to birds to mammals, would be forced out or face extinction. We're not talking about small-scale changes here. We're talking about transformations that could render vast sections of the Everglades uninhabitable for the species that have lived there for millennia. Wildlife displacement and behavioral anomalies. Now, the footage also captures something that experts didn't necessarily expect to see so clearly: wildlife behavior changes. The drone cameras recorded hundreds of hours of video, and when researchers analyzed it for animal behavior, they made some startling discoveries. In sections where water quality had degraded most severely, wildlife activity was significantly reduced. Birds that are normally abundant weren't present. Fish populations appeared sparse. Even alligators, which are incredibly adaptable, seem to be avoiding certain areas, which suggests those areas have become genuinely inhospitable. But that's not all. In some areas, the footage shows what appears to be unusual concentration of wildlife in specific locations. It's as if animals are being compressed into smaller and smaller habitable zones, creating overcrowding and competition that shouldn't naturally exist. This is a classic sign of habitat loss, organisms being forced into fewer available spaces. Researchers also observed behavioral patterns that suggest stress and adaptation. For instance, some bird species were being recorded in locations and behaviors that are atypical for them, suggesting they're being forced to adapt their normal patterns just to survive. This kind of plasticity in animal behavior can only be maintained for so long before populations begin to decline. One particularly alarming discovery involved manatee distribution. These creatures are sensitive to water conditions, and the footage shows dramatic shifts in where manatees are spending their time, concentrating in areas where water quality appears to be better preserved. This concentration might seem good for observation, but it's actually a red flag. It indicates that suitable habitat is shrinking. The unexpected findings that shocked researchers. Okay, so we've talked about water quality, vegetation changes, and wildlife displacement. But what about the truly unexpected discoveries? The things that came as a shock even to experienced researchers? First on that list, the discovery of what appears to be artificial disruption to natural water flow patterns. The drone footage, when analyzed in specific sections, shows evidence of blockages or changes to water channels that don't align with known construction or management projects. In some cases, these blockages appear to be natural, silting and debris accumulation. But in other cases, the patterns suggest something else might be involved. Researchers are still investigating exactly what's causing these disruptions, but the implications are clear. If water flow is being impeded, then the entire system's ability to maintain itself is compromised. The Everglades depends on consistent, steady water flow. Disrupt that, and everything downstream suffers. Second unexpected finding: evidence of what appears to be invasive species establishing themselves far more extensively than previously documented. The Everglades has always had problems with invasive species: Burmese pythons, iguanas, various invasive plants. But the drone footage suggests some of these species have proliferated far beyond what we thought. In some areas, you can actually see distinctive patterns of invasive vegetation, creating almost solid coverage where native vegetation once dominated. The python population, in particular, seems to be thriving according to visual indicators in the footage, which is concerning because pythons are apex predators with no natural enemies in Florida, and they're devastating to native wildlife populations. Third unexpected finding: evidence suggesting previous ecological assessments may have underestimated the extent of damage. Researchers had baseline data from years past, but when they compared that data to current drone footage, the differences were far more dramatic than gradual models would predict. Instead of seeing incremental, predictable change, they're seeing accelerating, non-linear transformation in some cases. This suggests that we may have crossed certain tipping points without realizing it, that the Everglades may be in a state of more fundamental transition than anyone publicly acknowledged. It's a discovery that's forcing scientists to recalibrate their understanding of how quickly these systems can change when stressed. What's causing all of this? This is the million-dollar question, and the answer is complex because it's not one single cause. It's a perfect storm of multiple stressors all hitting simultaneously. First, there's water management. Florida's water systems have been heavily modified over the past century to support agriculture and urban development. Dikes, levees, canals, and control structures regulate water flow in ways that don't align with the Everglades' natural patterns. This artificial management disrupts the natural hydrological cycle that the ecosystem evolved to depend on. Second, there's agricultural runoff. The farmland surrounding the Everglades uses fertilizers and pesticides extensively. Rainwater washes these chemicals into the swamp system, dramatically increasing nutrient levels. This is a primary driver of the algae blooms visible in the footage. The Everglades evolved in a low-nutrient environment, so it has no natural defenses against this kind of nutrient pollution. Third, there's saltwater intrusion driven by sea level rise and changing freshwater flow patterns. As sea levels rise, ocean water is moving further inland, and as freshwater flow is reduced by agricultural and urban demand, there's less freshwater pushing back against the intrusion. The result is increasing salinity in areas that should be freshwater, fundamentally altering which species can survive there. Fourth, there's the invasive species problem. Once these non-native species establish themselves, they thrive in the disrupted ecosystem in ways they wouldn't in a pristine environment. They compete with and prey upon native species, creating a cascading collapse through the food web. Fifth, there's climate change. Changing precipitation patterns, more intense storms, and shifting temperature regimes all stress ecosystems that evolved under historical climate conditions. The Everglades is particularly vulnerable because it's already a marginal environment. Any significant change pushes it toward collapse. Finally, there's simple habitat loss from direct conversion. Sections of the Everglades have been drained and developed for human use. While the drone footage is primarily of areas that still exist as swamps, even the remaining areas are remnants of a much larger historical system. The loss of that larger system means less buffering capacity, less resilience, and less ability to maintain ecological functions. Why nobody expected this scope of change? Here's something important to understand. This scale of change wasn't necessarily unexpected by scientists, but it wasn't being widely communicated to the public. There's a gap between what researchers know and what gets reported in mainstream media and public discourse. The reality is that environmental scientists have been warning about Everglades degradation for decades. But those warnings are often incremental, cautious, and presented in technical language that doesn't capture public imagination. When a researcher says phosphorus levels have increased by 35% since 1970, that doesn't have the same impact as showing drone footage of massive dead zones and disappeared vegetation. The particular shock of this footage is that it makes the change viscerally obvious. It's not abstract data anymore. It's visual evidence that you can actually see with your own eyes. People come to see wildlife, experience wilderness, and experience nature. As the ecosystem degrades, that recreational value disappears, affecting local economies that depend on tourism revenue. Fifth, there's the climate change implication. Wetlands like the Everglades store massive amounts of carbon in their soils. If these ecosystems are degraded or destroyed, that carbon is released into the atmosphere, exacerbating climate change. Conversely, if we restore and protect these ecosystems, they become carbon sinks that help mitigate climate change. Finally, there's what these findings tell us about other ecosystems. If the Everglades is changing faster than we expected, what about other wetlands, other forests, other ecosystems? The Everglades might be a canary in the coal mine, warning us that our models have been too conservative in predicting environmental change.